Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. Hawkeye is a week away, and we are back. Today, Storycast is here with a series preview that focuses on the comics that inspired the show, written by Matt Fraction and illustrated by Dave Aja and Javier Pulido. If you have not read these comics, do not worry. There's a ton of content for you here and very few spoilers. I don't think very many of the plot details are going to be super relevant to the show. What will be relevant is the way they rethink the character of Hawkeye, the tone and style of the comics, and the inspirations of the comic. So we're going to get into all of that, and you'll come away with a long list of great shows, movies, and more to watch if you want to get hyped for Hawkeye. Now, there are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we organize our approach. But just as the Marvel Universe has gone through phases, so too does the Marvelous TV Club. WandaVision was our testing ground, and Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Loki were our proving grounds for our first iteration. We showed that our unique model of breaking out weekly episode analysis into story, character, and big weird ideas can totally work. But we're also still in a pandemic, but there's a vaccine and life is returning to normal a little bit, and I do not have a spare 15 to 20 hours a week to prep, host, edit, and promote the 3 shows. So, until someone comes along to pay us enough to cover a lot of editing work, we are going to trim it back a bit for what I'm calling Phase 2 of the Marvelous TV Club. We will be coming at you once a week, and we'll be alternating between a Storycast and a Character Cast. Again, you'll get 1 episode a week from us, switching format every week to keep things fresh. Also, Character Cast is evolving. Jesse Taylor is going to join Christine Kippens and I for an epic team-up version of Character Cast. I cannot wait. We'll dig into what makes the characters tick, the larger issues surrounding them, and so much more. And then, the following week, we'll cover the next episode with this show, our Storycast. This is where we break down Marvel TV not by plot, but by themes, tropes, genres, and archetypes. Giving each of these shows the chance to totally own the MTVC conversation for the week will also be a little liberating. Folks were always careful to avoid stepping on other shows, which was super cool. But now we can all spread our wings a bit more and get into anything that fits the format of that week. So again, Character Cast will come at you next week after the premiere of Hawkeye. And beginning right now, Storycast is here with our preview episode. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. And as always on Storycast, I'm joined by 2 experts.
I'm Maeve Adams, Associate Professor of English at Manhattan College and the Director of the Digital Arts and Humanities Program.
I'm Amanda Marcotte, politics writer at Salon.com and notorious Twitter villain.
Facts. So folks haven't heard from you in a few months. Maeve, I feel like you've probably done something cool over the summer. Do you have any interesting anecdotes or stories or anything since the end of Loki that you want to share with folks and what you've been up to?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I came back to life after being buried alive in a pandemic. So, I feel pretty good about my summer. I got to see a lot of friends, family. Y'all came to visit. I got to know my new neighborhood in Bushwick. Did I do anything zany like I often do in the summer, like travel to some country I've never been to? No, sadly, that will have to wait still. But, I really feel like getting back to just normal life felt like a giant revelation.
See, this is what's wild about people's own lives, Maeve. They don't really even see their own headlines. You have basically completely saved the lives of like 7 cats over the course of this time.
It's true. I kind of forgot about that.
So, for folks who don't know, there's a cat named Pie, which is what Maeve calls her, who has unfortunately had 2 litters of kittens in a relatively short period of time over the course of this year. And Maeve finally was able to capture Pie and get Pie spayed. But as these kittens have just kept coming,
so many.
I don't even know. How many kittens are we up to, Maeve?
I mean, 7 or 7 million, it's hard to tell the difference. They just seem to just keep arriving on my deck. They are pretty cute, though.
She's getting them. She's getting them captured. She's getting them fixed. She's getting them adopted. The whole thing, it's unbelievable to see. And if you don't follow Maeve on socials, just follow her on Instagram precisely for more cat pictures.
All the cat content from Dr. Adams.
Amanda, what about you? What have you been up to? I mean, I sort of know some of the answers, I hope, anyway. but if there's any, now's the time to share, I guess.
Little do you know.
We're on the pod,
I mean, yeah, I got vaccinated. I
Whoop,
got a
whoop.
booster shot finally,
Whoop, whoop.
and I'm trying to live a normal life. We've been out. We've been going to restaurants. We've been going to the movies. We saw Black Widow and Shang-Chi in the movie theaters. Very exciting stuff.
And the Eternals.
And the Eternals. Just saw the Eternals. So back to normal seeing Marvel movies in the theater. That's the most exciting thing. I'm looking forward to seeing live music again. That's what I really missed over the pandemic, and haven't quite gotten there yet. But it was exciting seeing a movie in a movie theater. I forgot how much I missed that.
Yeah. Especially having a drink while seeing a movie in a movie theater. Just being able to like chill, you know.
Yeah, Philadelphia has like this weird pale imitation of an Alamo Draft House called the AMC Dine-In, but it has alcohol, and you know what? I'll take it. That's kind of how we roll.
Name.
We roll a drink or two deep here at the Marvelous TV Club. Well, as for me, I got to do my first college lecture thanks to Maeve. I got to come down to Manhattan College just on last Friday, actually, and talk to students about podcasting. Not like the details of like how you edit this and that, but more like the different genres and types of podcasts and how to think about it and frame a show and best practices to make your show make sense, which is, you know, all the kind of things I think about and work on here with the TV Club. So Maeve, that was super cool. Thank you very much.
Well, it was a pleasure to have you. And frankly, my students were overjoyed all day today. They kept emailing me and coming up to see me after class, being like, your friend Marc is so impressive. I really want to be like him when I grow up. I'm like, it's true. I want to be like him when I grow up too.
You guys are the best.
Your students all sound like, what's her name from Theranos?
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Oh my God. Hey, look, that voice works, apparently. That voice works. No, but for real, for any of the students who are listening to the Marvelous TV Club, thank you for being such a fantastic audience. I had such a great time. Now, let's get into this thing. Like I mentioned up top, today's preview is going to focus on the themes, influences, and archetypes of the comics that inspired the upcoming Hawkeye series. Now you might be like, Marc, how do you know which comics are going to inspire the series? Well, because they hired the writer of these comics, Matt Fraction, as a consulting producer on this series, and they use all the imagery. They didn't pay the illustrators the way that they paid Fraction, so that's a problem. But we know that they're going to draw on a 2012 series of Hawkeye comics from Matt Fraction, Dave Aja, and Javier Pulido. The series itself is called My Life as a Weapon, so if you need to like look it up online or anything, check that out. And I'll do a little plot overview at the top. Again, I don't think this is going to be spoilery. It's just a matter of giving you some details, especially in case you haven't read it, so that you can kind of follow along a little bit. But what we're really going to do is dive into the themes and the archetypes of this slightly reimagined character. We're going to talk about mentor and mentee stories that might have inspired the show. And we're going to talk about what we most hope to see being carried forward from the comics into the show. So let's begin with some basic plot details, and then I swear I will shut up and let the experts talk. So in this comic series, Hawkeye is a little bit reimagined. It's basically Clint trying to scale back and live a more normal life outside of avenging. Again, this is 2012. So he rents a warehouse apartment in Bed-Stuy, which at the time in Brooklyn is a neighborhood that was up and coming. Now it's obscenely hot shit and very pricey and expensive and fancy and whatnot. So it's fun to see a little step back in time to when Bed-Stuy was not that big of a deal. Although I would say in 2012 it was already turning over. But speaking of, one of the main arcs of the comics is that the building he moves into is owned by some Russian gangsters who are driving out the tenants so that they can sell the building for a fortune. Fortunately, Clint intervenes, first putting the Russian dudes in their place, and then realizing that functionally they're not exactly breaking the law, so he deals with it by buying them out and paying for the building and saving everyone's apartment, because he is an Avenger and he does have that dough. So that's the kind of story level we're dealing with. They do get a little wild at times. There's a fake assassination tape where Hawkeye kills a political leader, and Hawkeye has to retrieve that tape by literally outbidding every other criminal at a major auction. But of course, he screws up a bunch of stuff, and Kate Bishop, who we'll get to, has to come and save the day. Speaking of, Kate Bishop is already a character by the time this show starts. She first appears in a series called The Young Avenger. But what you need to know about Kate Bishop is that she's a fairly wealthy young woman who comes from a family. I believe her father was a publisher and not necessarily the best dude in the world. And she got into some trouble, and Hawkeye and the Avengers saved the day, and she became pretty impressed by Hawkeye precisely because he's a normal guy without superpowers who just runs around and saves the day with his particular talent, which is arrow stuff. So she adopts the same moniker, starts running around a little bit with that, And in the course of that becomes essentially, I wouldn't say like a sidekick, but we'll get into some of the relationship details between them because I think there's a lot to tease out in this episode. There's also a character named the Ringmaster who creates a show where he is basically robbing a bunch of other criminals like the Kingpin and tries to get away with it, but Hawkeye and Kate intervene. They save the lives of one of the wives of the Russian gangsters. There's all kinds of little things like that. But what matters is these little things, right? Clint saves the life of a dog, one of the dogs that was with one of these Russian gangsters, simply by being kind to it, and the dog becomes his dog, right? He helps a kid watch holiday cartoons because accidentally Clint might have put an arrow in the satellite dish that they used to watch the show. So those kinds of little moments and the scale of that comic is very different than what we were used to seeing. Clint himself is treated, I think, as a well-meaning, slightly jaded, maybe not the best planner in the world, these little things. And, I think, so those are some of the details. And of course, the story with the Russian gangsters continues to evolve. I won't go into over much detail on that, but there's just a lot of there to appreciate about him as a character and about the scene and setting of the time. And so that's kind of what's up in this comic. Amanda, Maeve, did I miss anything that you would want to mention plot-wise?
Just that Pizza Dog has his own issue that's completely wordless.
Oh my God, that's such a good issue. Yeah, great call. Yeah, so I think it runs for about 22 issues total. And then, of course, Kate Bishop gets her own series as well a little bit later, which is very similar to this. So there's a lot of great stuff there. But yeah, so we started particularly with the first volume of this. So there are 6 issues in there where Clint, again, tries to help the tenants of the building out, where he has to deal with this fake assassination tape, where he has to deal with criminals getting robbed by other criminals, and deal with holiday cartoons and the ability to watch them. Maeve, I want to start with you. What would you say, after reading this comic series, that the primary themes of the comic were? Like, what was it getting at, big idea-wise?
This comic is one of the more beautiful comics that I've read. And I just wanted to start with that because I feel like, when we talk about these TV shows, we don't often talk about the comic books, or we don't on Storycast talk about the comic books that are the source material for the television shows. And it was a real pleasure for me to read this comic, this set of issues of this comic, and think not just about what the show was going to produce or borrow from, but also how beautiful it is just as a text in its own right. And one of the things that I think the text captures really stunningly, really profoundly is the problems, the perils of inequality. It's a comic book that is explicit and aggressive in its take on socioeconomic inequality. That's kind of on the surface of the comic book, right? Like the 1% is kind of explicitly rendered evil. But I think it's more interesting than that, right? Like on the one hand, they're all thieves, right? This is the kind of language that the comic book uses to talk about the wealthy who make money during recessions when other people are starving or unable to pay their mortgages, losing their homes. These rich people are hanging out, going to a circus where they're getting robbed also. And so there's a kind of there's a sort of triumph there and sort of kind of schadenfreude, if you will, taking pleasure in watching these people suffer. But of course, Clint also and Kate also reflect on the fact that they are robbers robbing robbers who are robbing robbers, right? This sort of recursive robbing of people who don't deserve the ill-gotten gains that they have. So it's a comic book that's really obsessed with rendering the pain of inequality and the consequences of it. It's interesting too, because it's not really a Robin Hood story. I mean, there are kind of Robin Hood dimensions, right? He takes all this money and then he uses it to buy the building so that the people that he lives with don't end up losing their apartments when their rent gets jacked up 3 times as much as it was. But I think it's more complex than that.
Yeah, I'm curious because, Kate Bishop is wealthy as a character, and it's, I think, something that I would expect that they will keep about her character. But Clint is actually also fairly wealthy, even though he doesn't really seem to recognize or deal with it. How did you react reading that story about inequality with the fact that these are, essentially wealthy characters at the heart of it?
Yeah, it's tricky because Kate as a character is a wealthy character who, despite being wealthy, hasn't ever gotten the recognition that she wants. And I don't just mean like people know that I'm great, right? It's that she is incredibly talented and yet is subordinated to the superheroes of the universe. And so, on the one hand, we have Clint, who doesn't seem to quite get that he's wealthy. In fact, references the fact that if he's not working, he's not eating, right? Which doesn't make a ton of sense because he has a giant bag of money that he uses to initially pay the rent of all the people in his building. And then he ends up stealing all this money and using it to buy the building. But the story is also, I think, in a couple of ways, interested in inequality in a way that's more complex than simply a kind of reflection on, the 1% and the rest. Because Clint himself is in a gentrifying neighborhood, right? Bed-Stuy, Bed-Stuy is still a gentrifying neighborhood, but it was definitely a gentrifying neighborhood then. And that's really explicitly reflected on and recognized when Clint says rents aren't too bad yet. So, whether or not, the problem here is that Clint doesn't recognize that he's wealthy and really could do a lot of good. That's not why gentrification is problematic. That's not why that expression of inequality is problematic. And the comic book, again, recognizes this quite explicitly, because when Clint is talking about having a bunch of money, and he's like, well, money isn't everything. And the people that he lives with are like, wow, it's, must be nice to sort of live in a world where you don't think money is everything. Because for a lot of folks, right, that's just kind of a shitty thing to say to them when, it's like they can't put food on the table and they're going up to the roof, not just because they want community, but because maybe this is the way that some of those folks just get to eat, full stop.
There's the difference between Kate and Clint is really interesting on this front too, because Matt Fraction really uses those two characters and the fact that they both have a lot of money to explore an idea. I forget the name of the sociologist who kind of really was the French guy who was really the one who wrote a lot about this, but it's the idea of social capital and having class social capital is as important as money when it comes to class politics. Kate is brought up wealthy. She's an heiress. And so Clint always feels kind of next to her a little off-put, especially when they have to go to events and stuff where he's like, I grew up poor and orphan in the circus and I'm just a little rough on the edges. So he has financial capital, but Clint does not have social capital, whereas Kate is a socialite. She just is. And therefore she's at ease both in the world of wealthy people, but also just possessed of confidence that only those, and if you live in a kind of coastal city where you rub shoulders with people that did grow up that way, that just went to Ivy Leagues and didn't realize that there were any other colleges to go to, who just grew up with wealth, you recognize it immediately. The people who really, they're not even mean. It's never even occurred to them that their shit stinks. Yeah.
Right. Or have never had to sort of wonder if they are acting stupid in a room full of people who are wealthy and know better, quote unquote, know better. The philosopher that you're talking about is Pierre Bourdieu. Yeah. And the concept is cultural capital, but it's exactly what you're talking about. It's this sense that when you move into in social networks that grant you a knowledge of what it means to behave properly, quote unquote, then you're never anxious about whether or not you are being calm, right? There's that moment where Kate and Clint are, walking up the stairs and he's like, be calm. And she's like, nothing like saying be calm over and over again to not draw attention to yourself. But, for him, this is not something that he was raised in. It's not a milieu that he knows, exactly like what you're saying. I think it's interesting too, though, that it's a circus, because circuses we often kind of associate not with it's not the opera, I guess is, what I'm saying, right? So it's sort of a strange reference to be using for something that Kate would have sort of intimate knowledge of as a thing of cultural capital, because we don't tend to think of circuses as having that kind of status. Mm-hmm. So both of them bring to this a kind of knowledge. And it's strange, I think, strange and maybe meaningful that the comic book does that. It doesn't send them to the opera because it grants them an equal kind of contribution to the kind of knowledge they need to make this work. Which I think speaks to another, way that this comic book is grappling with inequality, and that has to do with gender, right? That the comic book is interested in a division of power and privilege, and reckoning with that division of power and privilege, the uneven distribution of those things, by also granting the two of them kind of equal status in the comic book. And I don't mean status, socioeconomic status, but a kind of status that they recognize in each other that ends up pushing against the kinds of inequality that dominate the world and impact their lives clearly, right? I mean, even impact Clint because of that horrible moment. I mean, it's in some ways my favorite moment in the comic book, but also I think like one of the most problematic ones and I think they're trying to do this intentionally where Kate says, "Why did you choose me?" And he says, "Because you're smart." And she's like, "Well, why not Spider-Man? Why not?" And he, stumbles into, "Because I don't want to have sex with you." And the fact that we get her response, like that whole page, it's worth just buying the comic book, I think, to look at this one page of the comic book where their back and forth is rendered in these little frames. And then it results in her being totally baffled by what sex has to do with this, really, right? Because the problem with gender inequality is that, when people say things like, well, sex gets in the way of our ability to work together and sex is a problem. It's like, no, sorry. No, the problem isn't that sex gets in the way. It's that women are sexual objects. And so that idea gets in the way of our ability to just do our jobs, No,
I think that was such a great little detail of like Fraction's comic that is Hawkeye fumbling his way to trying to do the right thing and say the right thing, but by doing so does exactly what you say, Maeve, which is highlight that, Kate is a sexual object, or very much could be, or that, at some level he deserves a cookie for not making her one, which of course he then immediately makes her by bringing it up. And just that panel handles it all really well. And it doesn't overdo it, right? Like Hawkeye isn't, tossed overboard or canceled or anything for this, but it's a great awkward moment because I think a lot of us have experienced that with colleagues of other genders as we've sort of navigated this world and tried to undo some of these well-learned prejudices.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a lot of sympathy for men who recognize that a lot of other men do this to women and they want to tell women, I don't do this to you, but they understand that it's very hard to do that without saying so explicitly. But when you say so explicitly, it brings the elephant back into the room, and it's like it's such a conundrum that there's no way to not feel sorry for Hawkeye and every other man this has happened to, because you can totally well-meaningly step into that puddle of shit.
Totally. I mean, it's like Clint put the harness on the elephant and dragged it back in. I mean, with all the good intention in the world of just recognizing that this is a way that some men might behave, and it might be a way that she thinks that he's thinking, right? And he's trying to say to her, I chose you because you're smart and because you're extremely talented. You're one of the best archers ever, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument that she's better than he is in the comics. He certainly wonders that from time to time, and there might be some evidence of that. I just watched Color of Money again last night as a mentor-mentee movie we might mention a little bit later, but one of the things that happens in that is you have a pool player who's aging out of prime reflex phase, and the young up-and-comer who can do stuff that he no longer can, and I think there's some hints of that as well between them, and Clint essentially being maybe not jealous of her youth, but certainly appreciates that there's, again, stuff that he's just maybe not able to do. Perils of inequality. I think there is a lot there to unpack from these comics. Amanda, what did you see as the theme or big idea of the Fraction comics?
This is the one I do think the TV show is probably most likely to dig into, particularly. And I think that's self-discovery, and particularly a midlife crisis kind of self-discovery. This is a very middle-aged story. It's about a man who has been doing a job for a long time, probably a couple decades in the comic book time. And he's starting to hit a wall of wondering, what's he doing with his life? Is this really the path that he wants to be on? Who is he? right? I think he's at that age in his career and in his life where he's beginning to realize he's about as good as he's ever going to be, and it doesn't really get any better than this. And the limitations of that, and the fact that that's a tough place to be, especially in a culture, in American culture particularly, kind of only recognizes fame and fortune as the measures of success.
Yeah.
And it's true that Clint is both famous and rich in the book, but compared to the other Avengers, he's a nobody, and he's constantly comparing himself to the other Avengers.
Yeah, I was going to say, because like he's doing pretty good, but you're saying relative to his peer group, maybe he's the one who feels a little small.
Yeah, exactly. And I think status is always relative, right? Success is always relative, or at least in this kind of measurement. And so he's in that space in his life, and he's really starting to ask himself all these questions about, like, who am I? Really? What does success mean, really? And he's discovering that the answer is all the things that you thought made for a good life, fame, fortune, things like that, are not actually it at all. But in fact, it's more importantly things like community, connection, and having an impact on the world, not because people think you're famous, but because you actually helped people. You actually did a good thing in this world. So in a lot of ways, the heroism of saving all these people's homes, that's not going to be on the front page of any newspaper. That's not the glitzy crap that he does with the Avengers. And yet it's implied very strongly in the comics that this is probably the best thing he's ever done in his life.
Yeah.
And more important than anything that's ever made him famous. And I think I suspect that the show's going to go in this route because they've already implied this a lot with Clint in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think it's going to be more so effective on audiences because the pandemic has caused a lot of people to have that moment in their life where they're asking these hard questions about, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah.
Is this really who I want to be? I mean, we've had this whole great resignation thing with millions of people quitting their jobs.
Yeah.
And I think Clint functionally quitting his job in this comic is especially evocative at this point in time.
It's interesting too, because the flip side of that is a constant recognition for Clint that whatever his relative sense of success or fame or fortune is, there are all these people around him with which he has community who will never achieve fame, success, fortune. And he's only just saving a small group of people from eviction. The kind of minuteness of his act of saving these people is both profound. It's also something that he realizes is small and therefore meaningful because it's something that he does to save these people's lives and they're save them from being evicted. But then I think there's something inside of that for us as readers because we can't unsee what he sees, that his action is small and the consequences are small. There's something in that about how damning the American dream is. And part of me thinks that there's something about that this comic book is trying to do in asking us to reimagine what we might think of as a midlife crisis, that there's maybe something more like a midlife reckoning that happens when we start to realize that there are all these people around us who will never achieve this thing called the American dream. And frankly, we're probably not really achieving it either. And inside of that, there's something, that kind of reckoning that we have with the vision we have, the vision we had, the kind of utopian conception of life and community has to get remade. And the question is, how do you remake it? Maybe it's these small acts. Maybe it's not just huge, super-powered activity. It's the small acts of generosity and kindness. And I am not trying to be a greeting card here. I'm not saying,
No, but you're right, because imagine if Tony Stark, instead of building the shit that led to Ultron, completely redesigned affordable housing in America with all of his money, or I don't know, loaned out some of that fusion tech he frickin' developed that, would change the whole universe.
I mean, I think it's implied that he has, and it's one of the funniest things about the Marvel Universe that probably by inventing a never-ending source of energy, Tony did more for the human race than all the smack 'em up, punch 'em up like headline grabbing
short of the
things he
snap.
ever
I
did.
mean, his snap definitely
Short of the snap.
did do
Short
a
of the
lot.
snap. But like,
look away from that.
if you could solve the energy crisis, you would be more important than anybody. But there's an interesting thing there, which is like, I think the Fraction comic, and this is like some of the best stuff that we all love and some of the best superhero work, is it actually interrogates the question, because the problem with superhero narratives, as fun as they are, they reiterate the American fascination with celebrity.
Yeah.
They reiterate this idea that what makes somebody important is how famous they are. And it's a fucked up situation where, you know, a lot of like the Kim Kardashian problem. I don't want to pick on her particularly because she seems like a nice person, but she's famous for being famous.
Yeah.
And is the most obvious example of somebody who everybody knows who she is and she has done nothing. Whereas how many of us can name off the top of our head the guy who invented nitrogen fixing, which saved 1 billion people from starvation?
Right. Well, there's another sort of even deeper problem inside of that I think makes the critique of a Kim Kardashian, which I don't mean just Kim, but, you know, like I know her, Kim, the problem with this conception of fame, the way that we root our understanding of the American dream inside of this vision of an unattainable dream. There's another philosopher, namely Lauren Berlant, who wrote a book called Cruel Optimism, where they try to understand what the tragedy of things like the American dream are. And the formulation of it that I think is really quite stunning and related to what you're talking about, Amanda, is that people are told to be optimistic about a future that contains in it aspirations that we're told to reach for our entire lives. But the conditions of your living and the conditions of your hoping for that thing run against your capacity to achieve that thing. And so the very optimism itself that you are told you must hold on to with every fiber of your being, despite all adversity, is itself cruel. That optimism is cruel. And it's a really profound, it's a really beautiful formulation. I think it's getting at a lot of the things that you're thinking about here.
The thing about superhero narratives that is interesting is that the superhero is considered a hero because they save ordinary people.
Yeah.
But by reiterating this kind of narrative about fame and power, they actually empty that idea of a lot of meaning, because the ordinary people are rendered as meaningless objects in the story.
And fragile.
And this story tells a different story. Every person is a unique individual who has value, even if they're not famous and even if no one knows their name.
Yeah. And even if their victories are tiny ones that just affect a neighbor or 5 neighbors or whatever, or even the life of another human that you're helping to bring up in the world as one of the best archers ever, who nobody recognizes.
Or the dog you saved, or in your case, the kitties you saved.
Yeah, the kitties you save and the families you make better by having them have kitties. You know, I think there's a lot there.
Exactly, because everybody needs a good kitty.
There are going to be some key differences between the Hawkeye of the MCU series and the Matt Fraction Hawkeye. The main one being that there is a family involved with MCU Hawkeye that there is not in the comic. The comic Hawkeye is a loner. It's a central, maybe the central defining quality of his life, short of the avenging and whatnot. So I thought it was really interesting how much this comic focused on the idea of found family. You obviously have Clint and Kate, neither of whom are particularly close with anyone in their actual family, as far as we can tell in the comics. But they rely on each other. They come through for each other in good times and bad. They bicker about stuff like family, but at the end of the day, again, their ability to trust and rely on each other means the world to both of them. But it is not just them. Clint in the apartment community that he first saves. And then also, they don't go overboard with that. Again, Clint accidentally takes out a satellite dish that almost ruins a kid's Christmas. There's lots of little things there, which is also a key part about being in a family. You help each other, you make some mistakes, you try to clean up your messes, all of that. You have Clint and Pizza Dog, aka Lucky, who he shows a small bit of kindness to by feeding the dog pizza, who then saves his life from the Russian gangsters who are about to shoot him. That dog and Clint have no prior relationship, but together they wind up, sharing filling a need in each other's lives, which again, I don't know that MCU Clint is exactly going to have. But the wild thing is, even the criminals in the comics kind of have a found family. The Russian gangsters themselves presumably aren't related, but they are tight, thick as thieves, that group. And then you have these big-time criminals, characters we've met or in this series are very likely to meet, like the Kingpin and Madame Mask. These bad guys who first get robbed by this evil circus Maeve was talking about that comes along and then hypnotizes them and steals all their stuff. And they bind together to deal with that. Of course, they realize Hawkeye ran away with everything at the end, and that creates other problems. But even in the subsequent episode where Hawkeye is trying to recapture this tape of his fake assassination, Madame Mask gets duped by Kate Bishop, who impersonates her and wins the day. And Kingpin is legit worried for her and is like, "Are you okay? What's going on?" And, look, that's meant they're bad people who've done a lot of bad stuff. But again, this idea of found family and relying on the people and building a community by choice, not just by blood, I think it just runs throughout the whole series.
You touch on one of my concerns about the show, which is one of the strengths of the comic is just this. Clint is a loner, and so he has to make a journey to finding this life meaning outside of his bullshit ideals about being a famous celebrity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in the MCU, Clint has already walked that path. He had having a biological family is one of the few things in movie making that you are allowed to value over these kind of American dream ambitions of fame and fortune.
Right. Family's
you are allowed to. Yeah. And so that's already kind of pre-built into the character. So I wonder if that's going to create a storytelling problem of them not having that to walk towards. So something to look out for.
Yeah. It's interesting because even the preview, it suggests though that he's divided in his loyalties, but not between Kate and his family, but between his sense of his capacity to do some good in the world and the worry that he has for his family. So I'm with you, Amanda. I'm curious to see how that unfolds. I have a lot of faith given the shows that we've talked about that they're going to do this well, but I'm curious to see how it unfolds.
Yeah, because I'm trying not to be cynical about this. There's such an obvious answer here, which is Clint spent 5 years as a serial killer called Ronin, running around doing awful shit. Not killing bad guys, but just he was no longer behaving like a good person, and that would leave a real imprint on him. So I can imagine that when you try to go home and be normal dad to these kids who don't even know that a second of time has passed or feel that a second of time has passed, that would go poorly. And you might
imagine if you partner went to hell for 5 years and then came back, but it's only been a day in your time,
or not even a day. But they come back completely changed, and that you would have
it could hurt your relationship very badly.
Yeah. So the idea that he would have been booted from the house until he can behave like a normal, moral person again, or just not, again, not to make Clint the bad guy exactly, but this happens in military families all the time. And there's a very real examples of this where when you've gone through something that the rest of your family hasn't like that, it can be very difficult to put that aside and, play Brady Bunch. So they don't appear to have done that based on the trailers. And it would have been such an easy choice. So everyone who knows me has heard this rant. I hope they come up with a smart way. And you're right, Maeve, that there's no reason for us to be anxious about it until they screw something up, because outside of What If, these shows have all taken their time and thought through a lot of the questions that we were all skeptical of going in.
I'm hoping that this is going to be my favorite Christmas movie of all time.
Hey, fingers crossed. But let's talk a little more about this Hawkeye then. And I'm going to stay on our comics Hawkeye because we haven't seen the series yet, so who knows what's going to happen. Let's talk about one of my favorite things about Storycast, which is literary archetypes for characters. So what literary archetype best fits this version, the Matt Fraction Comics version of Hawkeye? What does he fit into best and why? Amanda, let's start with you.
He is very much in the reluctant, retired warrior archetype. This is, in the 20th century version, is most familiar to us by Westerns and samurai films. It's always the person who is a badass in a former life, or for some other reason they're just super good at killing, they're super good at crime fighting, whatever, and yet they don't want to do it. They've either tried to leave that life behind or they reject the call of duty in some way.
Usually because they got a family or something.
Because they have a family
right.
or something. And some of the examples that I listed here are John Wick is probably one of the ones people like the most that are listening to this. The Bride in Kill Bill, her story and let me clarify that the impetus of the story is always they're forced back into the life somehow against their will. Like that's the story, is how they get there. Is it's usually either revenge or because they see a problem that only they can solve. So John Wick, The Bride, those are kind of classic revenge versions of this particular story. There's also the ones that are a little bit more people that have goodness in their heart, but they've become cynical people and they've decided to go on the life of crime. For instance, you often see the guy who's the bounty hunter, but now ends up having to save a village story. That's the Mandalorian. He's a bounty hunter who has kind of walked away from his higher calling, but ends up getting sucked back in because of Baby Yoda.
I mean, who doesn't get sucked in by Baby Yoda? I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, Star Wars is full of that stuff, right? You've got Obi-Wan, obviously, who's retired. That's a name I haven't heard for a long time, that stuff. And then you even have Han Solo, right, who Community made a ton of fun of for the reluctant leader forced in to be against his will to take over and help people.
Yeah, Han Solo is a classic example of the type. Joss Whedon's loves a reluctant warrior. I mean, all of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, she's a classic reluctant warrior. And in fact, probably one of the most heart-wrenching versions of the story ever told was on Buffy, where she kills herself in a self-sacrificing moment and they bring her back from the dead. And you find out that part of her motivation was selfish. She wanted to walk away from the life. And now that she's been dragged out of heaven and back into the fight, she's just miserable all the time.
Yeah.
But Firefly was that too. I mean, Mal was once this like warrior who actually believed in something. Now he's just a bounty hunter. And the entire series is about dragging him back to fighting the good fight for moral reasons. I think that Hawkeye is very much that character. He's presented in the comics as somebody who, I think gets a little bit caught up in the Avengers like lifestyle of fame and fortune. And he needs to kind of walk away. And only by going back to Bed-Stuy and living a more humble life does he begin to remember what his values were and what brought him back to being a hero, right?
It's nice too because that Firefly is one of my favorite TV shows in the sort of I'd probably say like top 20 favorite TV shows of all time. But one of the things that I love about Firefly is that his coming back to the job that he has to do is not simply about the job. It's not just about fame and glory. It's not just about wealth. It's also about community in the way that show manifests community in a way that Joss Whedon is actually really good at, helping us understand found families, right? Speaking of found families, the team on Firefly is a found family. And Inara is a wonderful example of this because Mal and Inara aren't just love interests. they're kind of competing for being the guide in the show for all the other characters, because Inara connects with River and she also helps guide Mal. And so Mal isn't just there as the kind of like masculine authority coming on in with my gun and I'm gonna get what's due to me, right? Like it's this whole community of people working together to help fill each other's lives in ways that I think that Hawkeye really also wants to think about. How do we fill each other's lives and how do we allow other people in, and that being a way to something other than fame and glory, but satisfaction and fulfillment and a meaningful life.
That touches on something that I think is really interesting about the reluctant warrior trope. And again, when I say it's a 20th century trope, it very explicitly is, because I think it is a modern retelling of the chivalric romance in a lot of ways. And especially since so much of the way that it is understood through the Western and all these kind of like films that borrow from Asian filmmaking, a lot of it is owed to the samurai films. So you see this a lot in samurai films, is the samurai, there's the corrupt government, the samurais lost their way, they become cynical. And then the way that they get back to their values is to embrace what is functionally a medieval feudal values system. And so it ends up being this story that ends up being kind of reactionary by saying that the way that you deal with corruption in a society is to fall back on these old feudalistic patriarchal values. And Westerns have this problem too. A lot of John Wayne movies have this problem where it's implied that the problems of modern society need to be dealt with by just regressing.
Yeah, I mean, that's
socially.
the sort of the origin of these things, as you said, is medieval, right? Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a medieval tale, an Arthurian tale that is about a knight, Sir Gawain, who goes off on this adventure. And we've all seen a version of this in The Green Knight, the film, if you've seen the film, which I think is actually quite good. It's a little boring, but the point you're making about medieval chivalric romance is really crucial to that story, because it's very basic. Sir Gawain kind of gets sort of sidetracked and then finds his way because Una of the true church, the one true church, guides him back to the sane path, and the path that will lead to the foundation of Britain and of course eventually the British Empire. But basically, this point, there's this super conservative consolidating narrative about how do we return to traditional modes. And and in this case, I mean, it's tricky because the Middle Ages, right? Like the one true church is indeed there, but there are also all these like competing pagan sects. So this is all the more important, right? That the one true church is coming in to kind of like consolidate everything and save the day and make everything better again.
Well, and you can see the thread between them in the fact that these stories depend so heavily on the utterly helpless, innocent victim that the hero has to protect, right?
Yeah.
And like, it's a dog in both Hawkeye and John Wick. It's women are often rendered utterly helpless and they're just objects. It's children that need to be saved. It's in samurai films, it's like impoverished villagers who have no skills for fighting war at all. In the Western, it's a white woman kidnapped by natives. I mean, those are the kinds of people. And again, it reiterates the idea that only masculine power and white masculine in the Western tradition, or, Japanese masculine in the samurai tradition, can save society. That said, I think that there's a way to rewrite these stories. Yeah. And that's why I brought up Buffy and Joss Whedon. Like you said, he rewrites these stories where you have all the romantic aspects of the duty calls to the hero who is reluctant and says no.
Right.
And yet the narrative ends up saying that you don't have to do it that way. Buffy ended with Buffy realizing that if she shared power with other people instead of hoarding it for herself. That was the answer to her problems. And I think that when you read the comic, he sets up a lot of the kind of chivalric romance tropes and the reluctant warrior tropes. There's, again, the dog. And then almost immediately you meet Kate Bishop, who in a traditional story would be the damsel in distress to be rescued, but in fact is Clint's equal, if not his better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly think that's a really interesting idea, that we are rethinking these reactionary narratives and subverting them and kind of pushing them forward in this progressive way. That's really cool. Maeve, what about you? When you look at this version of Hawkeye, the Matt Fraction guy, what did you see as an archetype for him?
So I see less of an archetype just for him as an archetype for the two of them, because we have these two characters and we will have them in the TV show, which is exciting. But we've got Hawkeyes here. And for me, this resonates with sort of buddy crime drama that we've seen in the MCU and across the history of film and literature, arguably. In the comic book, and I'm very much hoping in the television show, we have a real invocation of the buddy drama, that the buddy crime drama that is sort of the Nick and Nora figures. So Dashiell Hammett writes The Thin Man, right? In the 1930s, 1933, I believe. In fact, I think, fun fact, The Thin Man was serialized in Red Book. I mean, just let that drop like upon you.
The magazine, Red Book.
And also a magazine that we associate as a women's magazine, right? Red Book was a women's magazine. Fun fact from, a little bit of this is what happens in the 19th century. Fiction gets serialized, and it's still happening in the 20th century. But yeah, so Dashiell Hammett writes a novel called The Thin Man that includes characters Nick and Nora, who are a married couple. This gets made into a film in the 1930s.
Which everyone should see.
I rewatched it last night. Mark rewatched a film last night. I also rewatched a film last night that I was like, this is so, it was the first thing I thought about when I was reading this comic book. This is Nick and Nora in a totally different form, right? So Nick and Nora are a married couple, and they chance upon, essentially because of events, they chance upon a mystery of a person who's gone missing. And turns into a murder mystery, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to ruin it for you. You should definitely watch the movie because it's great.
No, you really should. Literally, even though all role-playing campaigns like in my Dungeons & Dragons stuff are set in, whatever fantasy land, most of my characters talk like William Powell, just because I think he plays Nick in this series. And, you're just doing the fast-talking 40s thing, and all of a sudden you're having a really good time. And it doesn't really make any sense, but everyone lets me do it.
We did a couple of characters who were a married couple that were basically based on Nick and Nora.
It's true. It's always fun. It's just a really good time to be watching that character is how can you not want to be more like Nick?
Yeah. And the thing that you need to know about these two characters is that it's a man and a woman, right? It's a couple, married couple in the 1930s. Who are constantly ribbing one another. They're constantly, sort of ribbing one another in a super sort of, it's not the way that you get in, for example, Mr. and Mrs. Smith in the Doug Liman film is a kind of variation of the Nick and Nora characters. But I hate that movie. Sorry if you love that movie. I really hate that movie. But the Nick and Nora characters are the kind of origin of that, where you have this bickering couple, but they're not really bickering. They're just kind of playing with one another. And
it's sexy.
And they both end up working as detectives together. It's a tricky film in terms of us thinking about what it would mean for a married couple to work together, because Nora mostly kind of stays at home and Nick does most of the work. But regardless, this is just the beginning of a whole series of films about Nick and Nora, where some of that stuff shifts over time. But what's interesting to me about this as a kind of origin or a kind of something that Hawkeye is, sort of evoking here is that we have these two figures who rib each other constantly, making fun of one another in fun ways. There's some sexual tension there, but they're also equal partners in a project. And it's important that this goes back to the 1930s because it's in the era shortly following women's suffrage. Women get to vote for the first time in the United States in 1920. 1934 isn't that long after, right? In terms of thinking about how long it took him to write this thing, and the novel turns into a movie and all of that. But this is a super important moment for trying to re-understand what it means for women to have roles in relationships that are not simply domestic, right? So, neither Nora nor Kate are particularly conceived as domestic goddesses, right? Kate definitely, right? Part of it is that she's wealthy, so she doesn't need to be a domestic goddess. But Nick also makes cocktails better than Nora does, or it seems that way because he's always the one taking the cocktails first out to the guests. And Clint, on occasion, is a kind of homemaker because he helps literally make a home for this whole family, a set of families that he kind of saves in this building.
I think if you watch the Nick and Nora films, they feel retrograde for modern people, but at the time, they couldn't have been more feminist. And I think the cultural memory of them is certainly that Nick and Nora are equals.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we also have a pizza dog with Nick and Nora. It's not quite pizza, but his name is Asta. And he goes along with them on their detective missions.
They don't have children. They have a dog.
I think they do eventually have a child, although I haven't seen that film.
God help us. That's terrible. That's not in the canon as far as I'm concerned.
They do have a kid eventually, but it barely matters. I mean.
Well, how old was William Powell by that point? I mean, he had to be like.
It's a question.
Yeah.
I will say one of the fun things about Nick and Nora and Clint and Kate as kind of parallels is that Nora is also the old money of the couple, right. And Nick is a middle-class ne'er-do-well that she marries kind of down to be with.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of threads there.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And obviously, there's going to be, in this show, a whole mentor-mentee relationship. We've been kind of hinting at that and talking about that. There's a ton to draw on, but I'm curious what you guys think of as the great examples of those kinds of mentor-mentee stories. What do you think the comic might have drawn on for influence and or the show might draw on for influence? Maeve, do you have any ideas on that front?
So I'm not sure influence is the right word for kind of how I've been thinking about the mentor-mentee relationship here, because I think there's something kind of radical happening in this comic book that doesn't happen in comics that I've read that address or use that mentor-mentee dynamic as a kind of structuring principle of the story. Because we've got the Batman-Robin story, which is a totally different mentor-mentee relationship. It is hierarchical. Batman knows everything. Robin knows nothing. Also, it matters, given my interest in inequality here, right? It matters because the Batman story, period, including the Batman-Robin story, but just the Batman story on its own, is a story about inequality too. Okay, so we've got something shared here, but it does something really different that I think is, in light of what we see in Hawkeye, kind of disappointing in Batman. Frankly, it's always been disappointing to me in the Batman story that we've got this like rich dude who saves everybody by way of his like profoundly advanced technology because he's got all this money. And, the story that's getting told there, this speaks to something that Amanda was talking about, is not different from the way we think about the American dream. Like if the whole idea is to be the wealthiest wealthy, right? Is to imagine yourself as like having power because you have wealth, that the Batman and Robin story confirms that's the right way to go. And it bleeds out into our culture. I'm not saying necessarily the Batman and Robin story does this, but this principle, this idea bleeds out into the world we live in, where philanthropy becomes the only way that we imagine saving the world, rather than, I don't know, remaking civil society and reimagining the welfare state, which could actually make all of our lives better. But for some reason, we're just incapable of like imagining ourselves out of this vision that like the rich do good in the world. Huh. But what about the fact that there are rich people of that level just doesn't do good for anybody.
There are some really interesting parallels between Batman and Robin and Clint and Kate. So we've mentioned that Clint is an orphan who grew up in the circus. Another famous orphan who grew up in the circus is Robin. Mm-hmm. Kate Bishop is the one with all the money, and I think there's some interesting inversions of the Bruce Wayne, Dick Grayson story, and I suspect that's intentional by Fraction, or he wouldn't have kept coming back to this whole I'm an orphan in a circus thing, because for comic fans, the only character that's really ever prominently been associated with is Robin. So what happens when Robin is the older one? Kate Bishop is frequently coming in and bailing out Clint in these scenarios in this comic in a way that if you were writing it from a different perspective might very well look like the mentor coming in and helping the mentee out. So this is a really interesting path to go down, this idea that like there's an inversion or a commentary on the Batman and Robin story.
There's something else I can't help myself. I need to say this because it's something I've been thinking about ever since I started reading the comic book, that, there's a reference that Hawkeye makes to James Bond in the comic book. And I was like, okay, so, James Bond isn't a mentor-mentee story. It's a Lone Ranger story, right? That's a Lone Ranger story. But Hawkeye,
he has a sidekick though.
It's true, actually. He does kind of have a sidekick. But Hawkeye is the Daniel Craig 007 to Batman's Sean Connery 007, which is something that I love about the new James Bond films, that we take this character who, in Sean Connery's figuration, was a sophisticate who has to degrade himself to be a thug. Whereas Daniel Craig's version of 007 is he's a thug who has to elevate himself awkwardly to be a sophisticate, which is not unlike what we see Clint trying to do, where he's like, oh, I'm going to have to wear this suit.
Interestingly, the Daniel Craig version is closer to the James Bond of the books.
Yes.
One of the things the most amazing cultural tell about that has confused people forever is his ordering martinis shaken, not stirred, is about, in the books, that was about James Bond doesn't have, again, cultural capital.
Right.
Because he grew up working class. So he doesn't know that you stir clear cocktails because otherwise they're cloudy.
Yeah. Exactly. Daniel Craig, 007.
Much better 007.
Much better.
Amanda, what about you? Did you think of any mentor-mentee stories that you felt really strong about?
I mean, there's so many of them. The one that obviously I think most of us think about a lot these days is Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid, especially with Mr. Miyagi being a classic reluctant warrior type. But I actually ended up spending more time thinking about the male-female ones, the older man, younger woman. And I realized that those actually are a little bit richer in terms of having that same kind of power differential, or power mix up that Maeve was talking about. So the two that come to mind are Buffy and Giles from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and the Hound and Arya from Game of Thrones. And in both cases, so with the Karate Kid, you have the classic mentor-mentee relationship. The mentee knows nothing. They have to learn everything from the mentor who knows everything. The mentor is very reluctant, but he loves this kid, so he saves him. Whereas in both the Hound and Arya's relationship and in Buffy and Giles' relationship, there's an argument that the young woman is actually the more powerful one. And that puts the older man in this interesting position. His dilemma is always, do I exert patriarchal authority over her? Or do I set her free and empower her with my power in the world to be more of herself, right? And those are such rich stories because there's good arguments for both. In both of those stories, these young women need kind of protection from the bigger world, but they also might do better in the long run if they're empowered, and the men in their lives have to think about that. And so I think you see a lot of that with the Clint and Kate relationship, which is she's probably the better archer, but he also does have some wisdom that she doesn't have in the world, and he doesn't know what to do with that.
Well, and you were talking about Karate Kid, Amanda. even in Cobra Kai, the new series on Netflix, it's obviously following up on all of that. Daniel LaRusso is a reluctant mentor to kids. He's very much playing that same role that Mr. Miyagi did in the original film.
And the best mentor-mentee stories have a piece of them where the mentor learns from the mentee as much as vice versa. And so I think, again, this goes back to what we were talking about, the difference between the reluctant warrior stories that are more like chivalric romances and more conservative versus the ones that try to be more progressive. I think you see the same thing in mentor-mentee relationships, which is there's the more interesting versions that do that. The mentee teaches the mentor as much as vice versa. So you see that with Buffy and Giles, where he learns from her about the importance of challenging tradition and leaning on your community. And you see that with the Hound and Arya, where he learns from her free spirit, right?
And it's great too, because both Giles and the Hound are kind of loner figures before they figure out that this mentee that they're supposed to be mentoring is actually guiding them to understand that these human relationships are enriching and crucial to their capacity to do the best that they can do, even inside the thing that they're mentoring, right? Like even inside that talent, right? Like Giles can't be the best of himself. Remember those moments in Buffy the Vampire Slayer where Giles like goes back to being the Ripper. Like there are those moments, right? And Buffy has guided him out of being that bully monster, sort of like laddish, sort of character.
And I really hope the show learns from those two shows, because both of those shows really do a good job of making sure that the older man is not the father to the younger woman or the lover.
Yeah.
Like that there's no confusion there, that they are actually a mentor-mentee relationship of the kind that we accept casually when it's same sex, from Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi to Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid, but like it has to be there.
Yeah, speaking of, another movie I rewatched yesterday for the first time in like 20 years was The Professional. And boy, howdy, do I hope that is a movie they do not draw on for this series. First of all, oh my God, the obvious and terrible problems of them sexualizing a 12-year-old kid, having her literally fall in love with Leon, the hitman. It's the worst trope of French cinema, but, it's just ubiquitous at the same time. It winds up obviously delegitimizing the entire nature of the mentor-mentee relationship. And what I came away with rewatching that movie was that it's such a fascinating window into the way that every creepy professor or supervisor or whatever imagines that their mentees think of them. It's how they imagine that their mentees look up to them, right? I've never been in love before. This is what a real person, you're so awesome at your job that I basically love you now. Like, I'm going to go to the store and buy all your shit. Like it was all just, it's a fucking nightmare. That story was just, really terrible. And we talked about the awkward moments between Clint and Kate that are in the comic, which I think are really good and show just...
At least they're both adults.
Yeah, but they're also not like the whole point is they're trying really hard as people to like keep it profesh, and I think that's...
And also to reckon with the stuff, this goes back to what Amanda was saying. I think she's exactly right. That we're not going to work this stuff out by not trying to work it out.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're not going to work it out by being perfect already at having figured all of this out.
Yeah, especially when you've grown up in a culture that is just trying to teach you all these bad lessons. So yeah, I'm excited for them not to do that. And I also made me think about Election a little bit, which is a story that also deals with a creepy, warped mentor-mentee between the teacher and the student, and there's all this sort of awkwardness there. But Election's whole point is that kind of gaze to someone who is younger than you and more junior than you and looking up to you is a horrible, horrible, horrible disease.
Yeah.
But we also need the positive to go with the negative. So hopefully this show can do it. It goes back to what you were saying about found family, Mark, because I think one of the things that makes mentor-mentee relationships so appealing is just that they're not a parent relationship. They're very explicitly not a parent relationship. The mentor in a good story should actually give you something the parent cannot, right? And in fact, it's often nice, like such as in The Karate Kid, where the mentee actually does have a parent in their life to distinguish the difference.
Yeah.
They're not a lover and they're not a friend.
Right.
It's nice to think about a world where we have all these people in our lives that can play different roles, and we can play those roles to different people. And not everything has to be narrow or sexualized or strictly defined by blood or sex,
Right.
Well, I only have one more question for y'all before we get out of here. I want to talk about some of the things from the comic that you most hope to see in the series. I want to ask you to do one at a time and go back and forth a little bit because I think our lists are all kind of long and it's awesome because there's so much good stuff. So I'm going to start with you, Amanda. What's the number one thing you hope they bring from the comic into the TV show?
Well, if I'm honest, goofy Russian gangsters going, "Hey, bro."
Hey, bro. Yeah.
In Russia, mentee mentors you.
I think we talk so much about how deep.
It's so bad.
We talk so much about how deep this comic is. I want to reiterate, it's hilarious.
So funny.
It's so good.
There's a panel where Hawkeye's in bed with a woman and he gets attacked and he jumps across the panel butt ass naked, and they just have a picture of the old Hawkeye face over his dick.
It's so incredible. I can't believe they got away with that.
I know. It's kind of amazing.
I want stuff like that in the show. Goofy Russian gangsters, extremely stupid jokes.
It's all over the place in that fight scene, right? It's also some guy's head is hiding his junk, and it's great.
Yeah.
It's great. I'm hoping there's more of that. I hope we get more of that. Bro,
right,
get the bro.
Jeremy Renner fighting naked, please. Give it to me.
Not objectifying, everybody. Not objectifying.
Maeve, what's your number one thing you hope to see?
I mean, this is more serious. It's not quite as funny. I love the fact that Clint is not your average savior figure. He doesn't want to be. He's bad at it. I want to keep it that way, right? He's self-aware and he's funny about his limitations. One of my favorite lines in the whole comic, they're like trying to escape from the creepy circus. And, I think it's Kate asks him, do you know how to drive a boat? And several panels later, he's like driving a boat and he says, I'm great at boats. And it's just like, no, you're shit at this. And I love that about you. So it's like two things. Like, it's like, I'm aware about my limitations, and that is bodily for him. And I want more of that. I want more of that recognition that these bodies of ours are human. And I want more of the fact that Clint, despite being a white dude, is not a savior of anyone. He's not a savior of his neighbors in Bed-Stuy, and he's not a savior of this woman who's a better archer than he is.
He's just a good guy.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Amanda, do you have a serious one as well for us?
Yeah, I think that it's especially important since the Marvel Universe is getting bigger and more cosmic. I mean, the last movie, The Eternals, was about faith in God and, I think kind of abortion. But it's very much about these big cosmic issues, right? As they get bigger and more galactic, it's kind of nice to have the smaller stories to root us back in our humanity. And I really am looking forward to this show being that taking the story as small as possible. Like literally just this neighborhood shit, dealing with gangsters, dealing with gentrification, dealing with shit that I think that most of us deal with in our daily life. And I think that would mean a lot to people in an era where our kind of small petty squabbles are beginning, I think, to feel more cosmic in their meaning these days.
There's a wonderful moment in the comic book where there's a newspaper that's sort of askew in one of the frames, and the headline is "Everything Awful. Oh God, somebody do something." And it's wonderful because it's both like hilarious, and it's also, I mean, think about the pandemic. For most of us, it wasn't like, what are the grim statistics on how many hundreds of thousands of people are dead now? It's, oh my God, get me out of my house. And those things are not disconnected. It's not like I'm being selfish by imagining that. These things are deeply connected. And of course, it's talking about the recession post 9/11. And so of course, everything awful is also catastrophic, but the catastrophe is felt at home. It's not felt. And, yes, we might be capable of imagining outwards to a universe where people are dying in hordes. But catastrophe is at home also. And to have a small story told about that is beautiful and important. You
have one more for us, Maeve?
I want more creepy circuses. I just want, look, WandaVision had one. I'm delighted to hear that there is another one. I don't actually have a whole lot of hope that we're going to get one, although we're probably going to get a creepy performance. It's Christmas time. So in the television show. So, I think maybe, I think it's possible. In the comic book, what I think is interesting about the way that the creepiness of the circus is figured, which is very different from WandaVision, is that people are forced to behave and inhabit roles that are simply performances for the sake of an audience, that are not more profound than that. And what Hawkeye says is that I was made a weapon. And that I think is something worth meditating on in much larger ways in terms of the way modern civil society turns humans into weapons. And if we can do it by way of a circus, thinking about the way that people are forced to kind of inhabit these thoroughly performative roles, nothing more substantial than, doing something risky for the sake of watching us risk your life. I think there could be something really, really profound and beautiful in that, that we need to think about. Maybe not beautiful, actually, just really sad.
One of the great things about the comic is, and I think they'll probably replicate this on the show, is how many stories open with Clint falling out of a window or in some other chaotic situation. It's like, okay, this looks bad. I have a t-shirt that even really says that. Okay, this looks bad. And the joke, of course, is that he's a fuck up and everything always goes sideways. But what's funny is there's a bit of resistance in there, is there not?
Yeah,
to be in a weapon. There's the constant chaos is actually a kind of source of joy and resistance to being instrumentalized in that way. Yeah. And a good comedy can really tap into that. And I'm really hoping this show does that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To our points earlier about the mentor-mentee relationship, one of the things that happens in the Creepy Circus story is that he meets someone who was also trained by the same mentor that he had in the circus, who was a bad person and taught him all these skills basically for evil. It's just that Clint broke good and this other guy broke bad, and they find themselves on opposite sides of the story. But the thing I hope they carry forward is also tangentially related to all of that, which is that the comic is surprisingly realistic in terms of violence, both the cost of doing it and the toll that it actually takes on your body. The comic is obviously incredibly fun, but at every turn, Hawkeye is shattered to pieces. And there's pretty good evidence that the show is going to go this route, right? You've got the tape on the nose and some of the other scuffs and scratches that you see, but he gets like a shattered pelvis. He gets in, he is in the ER like every single issue.
He loses his hearing too.
Yeah, he loses his hearing. There's all kinds of actual damage and implications. I have never loved a comic so much that made me not want to be a superhero. And I do think that it would be cool for them to dig into that as another way to tell a smaller story. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap this sucker up. Amanda, where can Marvelous TV Club fans find and follow you?
You can find me on Twitter at Amanda Marcotte, and I'm always writing at salon.com. Come check it out.
Maeve, where can people find and follow you?
You can find me on Twitter at Maeve Adams.
Fantastic. Now look, again, we're going to switch things up here. So you're going to get a character cast after those first 2 episodes. Remember, they're going to drop 2 of those on November 24th. And we'll get in on that holiday week sometime to get in there, record our stuff, and get back to you with an in-depth character cast featuring both Jesse Taylor and Christine Kippens. I am super excited about it. I hope you guys are going to enjoy it. It's going to be really fun to kind of alternate between these character deep dives and these story deep dives. It's going to be so much fun. All right, Audio Avengers, that is the show for today. We will be back next week, like I said, so keep an eye out for it. And if you're enjoying the show, don't be afraid to leave us a 5-star Apple review so we can rise in those search rankings. It would mean the world to us because the Marvelous TV Club isn't going anywhere. If you want to talk to me, find me on Twitter at Marc Faletti. Find the Marvelous TV Club on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram at Marvelous TV Club. And I'm Mark with a C. Don't forget that. All right, team, let's go grill on a rooftop somewhere, shall we?
Sounds great.